This is The Toss-Up, where an expert line panel dissects the hottest stories within the world of sports. From some of the nation's strongest college programs right here in Bloomington to the games and moments that capture the world's attention, it's all right here on The Toss-Up. Indiana University was founded 200 years ago, exactly. Less than 100 years later, and the Hoosiers had already accounted for multiple Olympic medals. And then, IU stepped into the forefront of collegiate and international athletics. Sure, we can talk about all the Hoosiers currently in pro sports, because there are plenty. But let's take things up a notch. Indiana Hoosiers have compiled over 220 Olympic berths and have earned 104 Olympic medals, and over half of those are gold. IU has an incredible history. Hoosiers have set records, Hoosiers have broken barriers, and Hoosiers have topped the world. We can't come close to mentioning every deserving Hoosier, but this week we're here to discuss some of the best of the best. So hello everybody and welcome to The Toss-Up. Joining me on the panel this week, we've got two powerhouses of IU media, Matt Cohen, Griffin Epstein. Thank you so much for being here. And we want to jump right in and talk about just some of these historic legends of IU. We'll start with some of these, more higher profile sports. You've got basketball and football, which IU has both had historic seasons and legacies in. And Matt, I want to start off with you. I know Bill Garrett is a big name around campus. The Fieldhouse just got named after him fairly recently within the past year. So why is Bill Garrett a name that Hoosier fans need to know and how important he is to IU's history?
He's obviously been a huge story the past couple months here on campus. The first kind of guys we're going to talk about, Bill Garrett, George Taliaferro, some of those guys, especially this year as we really have so much of this Black Lives Matter movement become so prevalent and so important to what where we as a society need to move to. Bill Garrett, at least in the sense of basketball, is an incredible example of really a pioneer member of IU athletics history. He was the first Black player in the Big Ten. He in terms of men's basketball, and he really broke a lot of barriers for. IU has had, if you look generally at the history of the school, it's had a lot of very successful Black athletes in his history. But Bill Garrett was the first. He was the first major Black athlete, and not only was he the first major Black athlete at the school, but he was very, very good. He was an all-time great in this basketball program, regardless of race, and he set up an era of Indiana basketball to be, what it's become on the heels of so many incredible players that have come through this program that have made Indiana the. You can discuss the merits of a blue blood program. I know people like to do that, but the national status of Indiana basketball.
Yeah, he really brought Indiana to that point. And then Griffin, another name is that Matt just mentioned is George Taliaferro. Why is he so significant? Sort of a similar stature. He just got a statue fairly recently as well on campus. So why should we know George Taliaferro?
Well, it's similar to Garrett that he was also a trailblazer, both in IU athletics and not just in Big Ten athletics, but football as a whole. He was the first Black player to be drafted in the NFL, which is obviously an incredible accomplishment. Was a great player in the NFL, but was a great player at Indiana at a time when he was here just a couple years before Bill Garrett came onto campus. Indiana was segregated. Bloomington was segregated. There's a great book about George Taliaferro's life, and coming from Gary, Indiana, playing on an all-Black team, to coming to Bloomington, where the city was basically divided in half, and African Americans could only basically live, eat, go to businesses on the west side of town, not the east side of the town where the university was, which made it extremely hard for him just class-wise, because he would have to walk all the way across town to get a haircut, to eat. He couldn't live on campus and then come back for classes. And of course, then we're talking about the football field, an almost completely white team playing against coaches, other players that we're not used to seeing other black players on the field. And not only, did he persevere and play, but, similar to Bill Garrett, was probably one of, I think even more than Bill Garrett, especially just because there's been so many great IU basketball players. Taliaferro is probably, you have to say, top 5 best Indiana football players of all time. College Football Hall of Fame. Obviously, there's a statue in front of the stadium of him. Yeah. And he was a part of the best Indiana football team of all time. Went 9-0-1, and we'll talk about some of his teammates and coaches later. But he was the leading rusher on that team. A true trailblazer, but just a truly great player on the field as well.
Oh, yeah, he was. And, I mean, if we want to stick with football and just some of, historic members of IU football, we have Pipp as well, who is in the National Football Hall of Fame. And, Griffin, I'll stick with you. What does this sort of level of skill and talent mean to an Indiana program, which historically has had its ups, but it's had far more downs?
Right. I mean, you look at Indiana football history, there are a lot of losing records. And it's not just recently, obviously Indiana hasn't won a bowl game since 1993. But I don't know the exact number. I don't know if Matt can name the exact number of bowl games they've won off the top of the head, but I think it's 3, something like that. That one undefeated season in the 40s, they went to 1 Rose Bowl. They won 2 Big Ten titles, including when it was called the Big Nine in that season in the 40s, including with Pie House. So it was a special time for Indiana football where they had the right level of talent together to put together a really special season, and one that's unrivaled in Indiana football history now, 75 years later almost.
Yeah, exactly. And if we want to talk about some of the beginnings of Hoosier athletic prominence, I think one of these characters that we really need to mention is Branch McCracken. And Matt, I'll let you elaborate on him. But he sort of founded and lifted IU in multiple sports to national prominence.
So when you think of Indiana basketball, typically the first name that comes to your mind would be Bob Knight. But
of course,
Branch McCracken, Indiana was already a relevant program before Bob Knight was the coach here, and that's because of Branch McCracken. Indiana's won 5 national championships. Branch McCracken won 2 of them. He was the original, superstar coach of this program, and there was Everett Dean before him too, but right. Branch McCracken was the got Indiana on the map as a national basketball program, and was a key reason why Indiana is seen as the step up for when Bob Knight made the move from Army to Indiana. He was the original creator of Indiana as a blue blood program. Obviously, that was continued, and we'll talk more about that.
Exactly.
But he was really the more foundational figure of what this program has become for basketball.
Yeah, he really was. And you mentioned Bob Knight, and we are going to address him very shortly. But first, I just want to say, obviously, there's so many other top basketball players, top football players. Of these guys, I just want to sort of open the floor to you guys, and Matt, I'll let you start off. Of players and coaches who also sort of deserve recognition for what they brought to this Indiana program.
I think the first one in terms of the major sport that stands out to me is probably Steve Alford. He was a player. And obviously he was a player. Duh. He played in the 80s on the 87 national championship team. He was a true superstar for Indiana. He was an incredible shooter. I don't think they had the 3-point line back then, but he was still, was someone who could stretch the floor at an age where you don't have the floor stretching the way it is now. He was a national superstar, led Indiana in almost everything. If you read, he's featured pretty prominently in the John Feinstein book, A Season on the Brink, because that's obviously he was still there at the time, the year before Indiana won the national championship. And he and Bob Knight would have some arguments in practice, just like every star player would with Bob Knight. But he was someone that it seemed like everyone loved him at the time. Obviously, us, a bunch of 20-year-olds, can't really speak to exactly the way he was loved in Indiana, but he seemed to be a really beloved figure. His coaching career has obviously been pretty nationally relevant, but hasn't accomplished a ton as a college head coach. But he keeps getting jobs because of his success as a player at Indiana.
Yeah, and Griffin, obviously, there's so many other guys, and aside from Alford, who are some people you want to point out?
Yeah, I'll move back to the football side, and I think Antoine Randall, you have to mention. He didn't have a lot of success in terms of the wins, but he was probably the most electrifying player in Indiana football history. Went on to win a Super Bowl with the Steelers as kind of a athlete, do-it-all punt returner, could play some wide receiver, obviously played quarterback at IU. And I remember I was at a game last season and going up to the elevator, the press box, and one of the ladies that had been running, been a security guard or a, concierge, whatever you want to call it, mentioned it right away. The stadium has never rocked like it did when Antoine Randall out here, and they would fill Memorial Stadium, which is, except when Ohio State and Michigan come to town. You never see, he was a dynamic player. I think he finished 6th in the Heisman voting his senior year. And yeah, it didn't translate to wins, but it translated to a level of excitement that's really never been seen in Indiana football history. And for a program that's one of the worst all time in the Power 5, for a couple of years, he was a difference maker. And I think in the present day, you look at a similar model of a quarterback in Michael Penix, something that Indiana, I think, is continuing to try to create, and what Tom Allen is trying to recruit in terms of quarterbacks, a little bit of throwing it back to Antoine Randall and what he brought to Indiana football at the turn of the century.
Yeah, and just a couple people I want to throw out. One in particular I need to mention is Bo McMillan, because this man took an Indiana Hoosiers football team through an undefeated Big Ten slate. Which camera am I looking to? Undefeated Indiana Hoosiers football team in conference play. That is incredible.
I believe he's the only Indiana football coach to leave here with a winning record.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see what Tom Allen does in his young career, but yeah, Bo McMillan was absolutely incredible. And I mean, of course, you have tons of other guys. Walt Bellamy, I believe, won an Olympic gold and was obviously a Hoosier basketball legend. But I think the big name when it comes to basketball is Bob Knight. And so, Matt, I'll start with you. This man has such a storied yet complicated legacy. One of the most winningest coaches of all time in college basketball. But dare I say, a little bit of a temper? That might be an understatement there. So, Matt, where do you think Bob Knight sits in terms of his legacy at Indiana University?
So I guess from work I've done in college, kind of covering Bob Knight, especially last year as he made his return to Assembly Hall, a question I got asked a lot is, I was 11 months old when Bob Knight was fired. I'm from Maryland. I have no, I didn't grow up in the midst of Indiana basketball like so many of my friends and colleagues here at Indiana have. But the thing with Bob Knight that was always asked to me is like, how do you really square his legacy? And it's an interesting question because a lot of people that I've met that are from Indiana and are, older Indiana basketball fans, a lot of them will, I would say, I don't think forget is maybe the right word to use, but like will definitely a little bit give more precedent to all the wins that he had. I mean, at the time of his retirement, he was the winningest coach ever in college basketball, won 3 national championships. I mean, he was a very, very successful coach. But you also, as much as he shaped Indiana basketball to what it is right now, he also has a past that's littered with, anger outbursts, racism, sexism. There are some things that he has done, like multiple things that he has done that would get a coach now fired immediately.
Exactly.
But he at times, and there's been so much documentation, and the ESPN 30 for 30 does a really good job of this, talked about how Bob Knight basically ran the athletic program and could get away with anything. And I think as we look back on him 20 years later, sure, yes, he won a lot of basketball games. And at some point, for a lot of people, winning tends to outweigh how they view people. But I think as someone who I feel objective in the regard of looking at him because I never grew up in the midst of any of that, that I just think it's important that when you consider his legacy, you consider all of it. And not just that he won a lot of basketball games, but that he also, he pretended to whip a black player on his team. He made comments about if I think he said, and this is not the exact quote, but it was something like, if rape is inevitable, try to enjoy it. I mean, those are those are things that would get any other coach fired immediately. I mean, he made some incredibly racist comments to Puerto Ricans when he was down there for a tournament there. I think with the U.S. national team, and it just, I mean, I think it's you can't forget that in terms of all the excitement that was here when he was back last year. It's just there's a reason why he was fired. If there wasn't anything bad that happened, his firing A would never have happened.
Of course.
And B, it wouldn't be a big deal that he came back. And I think that's all really important when you consider his legacy.
Yeah, and that's why we have to sit and look at the legacy as a whole. Obviously, a ton of wins. And Griffin, real quick, I'll give you the last word on Bob Knight before we go to break. But when you look at that sort of the stature and all of the wins and the national titles that he brought to the program, how do you balance that with, allegations of racism and abuse and some of these that have very well been documented?
Well, Matt said it really well, and not a plug, but if you haven't read Matt's article from last year in the IDS about Bob Knight coming back and that process and his legacy, that's a must read. But I think, Matt said it really well, and you can put it in the perspective of, we've seen it at other schools. I don't think it's comparable, but Joe Paterno with Penn State, of someone who had so much power, could essentially get away with what they wanted, and where wins and losses became the number one most important thing. And in college athletics, it's always a fine balance of how much are you balancing wins, losses, national championships in a state that, none of the three of us grew up in, so we have a little bit different of perspective, or where people are really insane about basketball. And most of the time it's great. But how much are you sacrificing these, obviously horrific actions that Knight has occurred and done and been a very bad role model for his players, for the community, for the state, for the school? How do you balance that with winning 3 national championships and bringing so much joy and so much pride? And, we could sit here and debate it and discuss it for 2 hours. There's no easy answer. But I think you do. You have to put that in perspective. You have to put the wins in perspective. And I think he's done a lot of good for college basketball. Obviously, you saw how happy so many of the players, Isaiah Thomas, Quinn Buckner, were to see him come back and how much they have meant to him. But he's also meant a lot of negatives to a lot of people and been a very bad role model when he needs to be one of the best. So There's no good answer, but I think it's important to put both in perspective.
Of course not. It's a great conversation to have, and I'm glad we're able to have it. We will take a break, and coming up after the break, hopefully a little lighter of a note, is we have all sorts of other Hoosiers to talk about. So many historic Hoosiers to discuss that have made their mark on a wide range of sports. So thanks for joining us through this first half, and make sure you stick with us. Welcome back to the Toss-Up. Now, before the break, we discussed several legendary IU coaches and players, of course, but there are even more who have helped build up all sorts of programs. So, welcome back to the show. I'm going to start with men's soccer, which has been historic, not only lately, but even fairly recently. The quest for 9 has been ongoing. And Jerry and Todd Yeagley, a father and son combo, who've meant so much to the program. And Matt, why have their contributions been so relevant?
So before Jerry Yeagley was the coach here, and I mean, Indiana soccer was just a program. I mean, they weren't super national relevant. They were just, Indiana had a soccer team. I mean, frankly, Indiana didn't really have, even a Division I soccer team long before Jerry Yeagley. He then took this program, and Jerry Yeagley, I think it's a fair statement to say he's the greatest college coach of all time. I mean, he won.
For men's soccer.
For men's soccer.
Not all sports.
Yes, correct. For men. I mean, you can make an argument, but I mean, it'd be a tough argument.
Yes.
But I think it's a doable argument.
Right.
He was the coach here for over 30 years, won a handful of national championships. I mean, he got Indiana to be, I believe St. Louis has won the most national championships with 10. Indiana's won 8, and all 8 of them have come in the last 30 years, 40 years.
And now you have Todd to go carry on the legacy.
Exactly. And it's continued. There was a bit of there was some transition years. It was not straight Jerry Yeagley to Todd Yeagley. There were some years in between. And, Indiana wasn't bad in those years, but it was not its typical level of dominance. But when it's had a Yeagley as the coach of the team, Indiana's been dominant in soccer. It has been the preeminent national power. Indiana, let's be honest, they probably should have won 2 national championships in the past 3 years with
They had the capacity to, for
yeah.
sure.
They won a stretch over the 2017-18 season, 2018-19 season, right? Where they went undefeated and lost the Stanford National Championship game, came back the year after, went back to the College Cup, were certainly the best team in that College Cup, and just did not have it one night against Maryland. And they just could not get past Duncan Pines, who's now turned into a really consistent player in the MLS. And they could have way more than 9 right now. They could be the winningest program ever in terms of national championships.
Yeah, and there's still a ton of potential
Exactly.
for them to be able to do it.
They could still win the national championship this year if the season happens.
Right.
That's obviously a big if. But Indiana, the fact that right now, you could say almost every year when Todd and Jerry Yeagley were the coach, that team could win the national championship game.
Yeah.
And that's a really incredible stretch of dominance for that program.
It has been. And a similar program that we've seen in stature, historically they've been incredibly dominant, but even now is the men's and women's swim and dive programs headed by Ray Lewis, who we could discuss Ray Lewis and where he stands through how he's been able to build up these programs. An Olympic coach in his own right and still the current swim coach, I should say, Drew Johansson for the diving team. But yeah, I'm getting off on a tangent here now, but obviously you've got Councilman and Billingsley, who the pool is basically named after those, Hobie Billingsley and Doc Councilman. They've built up the program, and then we've seen Mark Spitz and even more recently Lily King just dominate the swimming pool and the Olympics. So Griffin, out of this swim program, all of these powerhouses, who stands out to you and why?
Well, I think it starts obviously with the coaches, and it's kind of similar to the Yeagleys, who really brought up this men's soccer program and built it into a consistent powerhouse. You look at Billingsley, you look at Councilman, they were the same thing. You wouldn't think of swimming being a powerhouse sport in the cold Midwest where, it's snowing 4 months of the year. You'd think of it out in California, down in Florida. But because of the coaches, because of the program they built, because of an excellent facility that still stands in the Doc Councilman pool and diving facility, they were able to attract some incredible swimmers. Mark Spitz, who's probably the most notable IU swimmer, went to the Olympics in '64, had a bad performance, wanted to go to college, wanted to find a coach that was going to make him better. Doc Councilman was that guy, and Spitz says he was the most influential person in making him into, until Michael Phelps, probably the best swimmer anywhere of all time. Spitz would win 7 gold medals in Munich and would be until Phelps broke his record, would have the most medals of all time of any Olympian ever. Which is obviously just incredible. And then, it's the same thing with men's soccer, that the program is continuing to turn out some of the best swimmers in the world. Obviously, Lily King was one of the superstars. That was the 2016 Olympics in
Right.
Rio. The famous finger wag before she won the 100-meter breaststroke. She won a couple gold medals there, up there with one of the better swimmers of all time. And she's also she's a standard bearer for the program. She was sitting here just last year, came on the CBS Sports Network show when she was here, and just part of some amazing people beyond the pool that I think IU has built and continues to build as one of the strongest programs, along with Michigan, in the Big Ten for both men's and women's swimming.
Yeah, and then while we're on the topic of Olympic sports, you've got golfers, you've got track and field. I think there's been fencers, like pole vaulters, who have all been a part of Indiana history. And wrestlers, of course, as well. I guess the main wrestler that we can talk about right now is Angel Escobedo. And Griffin, I'll let you talk about him currently coaching at IU. And, of course, the legacy of guys like, Billy Thom, also a wrestling coach. And, so many competitors from these other sports, Carmichael or Cochran or Bell. Just out of that group, who really stands out?
Well, yeah, Escobedo, got a pleasure to know him a little bit now in his third year now with IU wrestling, and I think he's going to really build that program up. But not too long ago, he graduated back in the 2000s. He was a 4-time All-American, won the national championship, which is just one wrestler in a weight class winning it. Obviously, incredibly hard to do. Won the Big Ten multiple times, the best conference in wrestling. and just a leader. As a wrestler back then, bringing a wrestling program back to relevance that, as you mentioned, was very successful under Billy Thom way back in the 1930s and 40s, and now coming back to coach. He is the only black wrestling coach in the Big Ten. I think that means a lot to him, and he's a leader on and off the mat. You want a coach that has that experience of winning national championships, being an All-American, and also being a great leader and family man. And I think Escobedo is what Cream and Crimson Athletics are all about.
100%. And then, Matt, I know you know your baseball and softball. We're just going down the list on these sports now. Speaking of champions, Michelle Venturella won an Olympic gold within the past few decades. And then, you could pick all sorts of IU baseball players. I think Ted Kluszewski might be one of the most famous, Kyle Schwarber right now. What does it mean for these baseball, softball, these programs that aren't at the same sort of caliber as football and basketball maybe, but to start trying to work their way up as well?
So I think baseball and softball have both seen new stadiums open up in the more recent years. You've seen, they have some players, like you mentioned, Venturella, Kluszewski, sorry, I always pronounced that wrong. I apologize.
Close enough, yeah.
I hate to butcher names on TV, but you've seen them both open up new stadiums. If you look at baseball specifically, because I think you've seen a more massive jump in baseball over the past decade compared to softball, which granted has been really, really competitive the past few years. But the facilities are a huge piece of it. Fred Glass is something that now that Scott Dolson's the athletic director, you look back at Fred Glass's tenure, and he put a lot of money into Olympic sports programs, especially baseball and softball, I guess, not consistently Olympic sports, but
right, but at that sort of level,
the non-revenue sports, basically. And you can see the massive facilities upgrades that came under Fred Glass, and putting money into those programs allowed them to win. Baseball specifically, they went from a Sam Bauer field. That was a high school field. It really was. And now they're at Bart Kaufman, one of the better stadiums in the Big Ten, without a doubt. And then now you have Indiana, who was consistently the basement team in the Big Ten before Bart Kaufman existed, has been to a College World Series in the past decade, is consistently one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the conference. Softball's working their way up there too. They're an NCAA tournament contender now pretty consistently under Shonda Stanton. And you're seeing sports like that were not typically relevant until very recently at Indiana, starting to be sports that not only are getting attention in terms of their national competition level. They're both teams that have been ranked the past few years, and been competing at a national level, but you're also now seeing people start to care about those sports.
Yeah, there's both programs that are starting to see starting to be on the rise, I guess. There's all sorts of programs like that in Indiana, and I know one of them has been women's basketball, which I feel like we need to talk about. In terms of some of the best in history, you could talk right now. You've got players currently on the program. This is some of the best women's basketball we've seen in IU's history. But at the same time, you've got players like Vanderveer, if you want to go back several decades, and Kay Burris as well, who basically sort of founded these programs. Matt, I'll let you talk about those two and just how they've sort of built up women's basketball.
So Kay Burris was really the person who built women's basketball. She was the first women's basketball coach that Indiana had in terms of a program that competed against other colleges and traveled. They had some smaller teams, but not really a truly competitive team until Kay Burris really started coaching them and formed a team. Kay Burris also started the field hockey program, and you get down the line. Indiana women's basketball again, has some years, but they're not really a truly nationally relevant program until fairly recently. Tara Vanderveer, as you mentioned, is an alumni of the program, good player at Indiana. She was a transfer from Albany, I believe. But she's really made her mark as one of the greatest coaches ever at Stanford.
Exactly.
I think she has over 800 winning percentage all time. She's won 2 national championships. I know that's right up your alley in the San Francisco Bay Area. But she's been really. Stanford's good every single year. And I was, she's also someone that came to Indiana a little, in reference because Bob Knight was here at the time. And Bob Knight's not coaching the women's program, but she saw a lot of what Bob Knight did as a coach at Indiana. After she was a player, she went to some of Bob Knight's practices to watch as a player, and then after her playing career, she went to some Bob Knight clinics and tried to take some things off of Bob Knight in terms of a coach, in terms of the way that he ran his practices. You can discuss the merits of how he ran his practices.
Exactly.
But she liked them, and she tried to take some tips from him and try to learn from Bob Knight, the coach aspect of Bob Knight.
Yeah, to try and bring some of the good stuff out of Bob Knight. And I think we've seen that. She's one of those players who was incredibly successful at Indiana University and then went on to be an incredibly successful coach, perhaps even more successful. And we've seen, guys like Angel Escobedo's trying to do that. And Griffin, I'm going to wrap up with you with one more name. That's Kayla Bashore, another competitor who's trying to do that for the field hockey program, which doesn't really get much love at Indiana. It's still a fairly young program. But Bashore is an Olympian from IU field hockey and is now trying to turn that program around. And, what does it mean for these programs on the rise that are getting these new coaches and that are getting a lot of the historical IU athletes to come back and sort of contribute once more in their own fashion?
Well, it's huge, and it's especially big for sports. Like swimming was not an established sport in the Midwest. IU made it a sport in Indiana. Field hockey is not really a big sport in the Midwest, but Bashore, being a successful athlete, comes back knowing what it takes to be successful in a place where no one else has been successful, essentially a trailblazer, now trying to come back and lead a program that doesn't get a lot of attention in Indiana. Only a couple other Big Ten schools have field hockey programs. So, it's trying to set something and trying to create something like with women's basketball took so much time until finally under Terry Morin and this current crop of players, they've become the last couple years one of the best teams in the Big Ten. But it's taken 40 years. And I think you look at a lot of Indiana programs, whether it's the golf teams, whether it's the wrestling team, they've had periods of success, but over the long run, they've really struggled to get that consistency. But when you have an athlete like Bashore come into a field hockey program that has not been very good at all since they've been around, that winning mentality you think might eventually transfer over to the players. And, you hope right now it's such a hard time with college athletics. You hope these coaches coming in can get fan bases excited, get fans back when fans can be back. And you see a lot of these Olympic sports continue to have success, and the ones that haven't continue to rise up and get better for the Hoosiers.
Yeah, and obviously we hope that sports is able to come back in full swing. In the meantime, I love being able to look back at the history of all of these programs and being able to recognize some of the greats. And again, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
There are so many other greats, but that is going to be how we wrap up our show. So thank you all for joining me, and thank you for joining us to watch us today. That does do it for the show this week. But be sure to continue our discussion on our Twitter page at IUSTV Sports, on Facebook, Instagram at IUSTV Sports. You can always give any suggestions for the show, ask any questions you might have, toss it up, find out if we'll catch it, and we'll see you next time.